speed in the lane, still getting it.
And welcome to another edition of Real Moments. I'm Yvonne McCormick-Lyons, the founder and director of the Women's International Film Festival, as mentioned in the intro. And as you know, Real Moments is a podcast that I developed to continue our discussion about women and women in film. This podcast, of course, called Real Moments with BadAss Women in Film and Entertainment, is really to highlight women in the industry, what's going on, and at the same time, for those people who have, quote unquote, made it, to give back by giving advice to those who are interested in becoming up and coming in the industry. So I'm really excited today because with me is ALelia Bundles. And she and I were just talking about how we met like 25 years ago. So we just got a chance to reconnect. But we met at a concert, actually. A mutual friend had taken me to the concert and the three of us were there and enjoyed it. It was a third world concert in Washington, D.C. So I'm really happy to reconnect with her. But let me explain to the people who don't know who ALelia is. So ALelia Bundles is an American journalist, news producer, spending 30 years as an executive producer and Emmy-winning producer with ABC News and NBC News. She's a graduate of Harvard College, Columbia University School of Journalism, where she currently sits as a trustee. She's also a speaker and author, known for her 2001 biography of her great-great-grandmother, Madame C.J. Walker. The book, which is called On Her Own Ground, Life and Times of Madame C.J. Walker, is a New York Times notable book and the nonfiction source for SelfMade, the fictionalized 4-part Netflix series starring Oscar winner Octavia Spencer that premiered March 20th, 2020. And so for those who don't know why Madame C.J. Walker, your great-great-grandmother, is important to American history, should I say it or do you want it? She is the first self-made woman millionaire in American history.
That's right.
So that's amazing and it's important. Why did you feel that her story, in addition to that, is important to tell?
Well, and for me, the Guinness Book of World Records says Madam Walker was the first self-made American woman millionaire. And I know that's a great headline for people, yes. But I have to tell you, honestly, it's not what makes her important to me. Yes. I really like to focus on her journey from being the first child in her family born into freedom in 1867 on the same plantation in Delta, Louisiana, where her parents and older siblings had been enslaved. And then to look at her journey as a washerwoman in St. Louis, losing her hair, developing a product that restored her hair, that healed scalp infections, and then getting mentored by women of her church, AME, the AME church, and really seeing the power of women. And then as she founded her company, turning around and empowering other women. And then using the money that she made through her Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company to be a philanthropist, a political activist, a supporter of the anti-lynching movement, and somebody who helped create generational wealth. So the first self-made millionaire, that's an interesting headline for a lot of folks, but I really love the journey of empowering women.
Awesome. And I want to dig deeper to some of those points that you've made. And that's what we're about here at Real Moments, as well as with the Women's International Film Festival. We say that it's empowering women's visions and women's voices. So Madame C.J. Walker, I hope she would have been a fan of what we're doing in terms of empowering our visions and voices.
Well, I will just tell you, yes. She loved movies.
Yeah.
So she hired filmmakers, even though we don't have any of the existing film. But yes. She also was very clear about the power of images, and she traveled around with a stereopticon, an early version of PowerPoint,
Yes.
telling the narrative of Black people. So she would have been right on board with you.
Oh, good. I'm so glad to hear that. I'm really glad to hear that, especially coming from you. So I know that SelfMade, an amazing story. Actually, it was my husband who said to me, Yvonne, did you know that this? And I'm like, yeah, I heard about it. And then, you know, it was Netflix, and it was around the time of the pandemic, right? So we would all pretty well, the whole world at that point was pretty well shut down in terms of going out. So, you know, when I saw that it's starring Octavia Spencer, oh my goodness, Academy Award winner, and Blair Underwood, who we all love.
Right.
We've loved Blair from LA Law from way, way, way back. And Tiffany Haddish and Carmen Ejogo, right? Who I watched in The Avengers and Selma, and probably most recently I watched her every episode in The Girlfriend Experiment. So that's like an amazing cast. So I want to kind of step back, and I'm sure you were excited about the fact that these amazing artists were going to be, you know, portraying these characters in the movie.
Absolutely. So the Octavia Spencer, of course, is a tour de force.
Yes.
And for me, she is the person who so well embodies who Madam Walker was, her tenacity, her determination, even her vulnerability. And I could not think of a better person to play this role than Madam Walker. Though, of course, you know, my book is 20 years old. So it's been through other iterations with other actors who were up for playing that role. But I think the universe kind of waited on Octavia to be who she is and to be where she is in her career to take that role.
Yeah, and she's a wonderful actress. So I want to dig a little bit deeper and go back, because I was reading a number of articles about how the project came about. So can we talk about that? Because you said that there are a number of iterations. How did this one happen that you ended up working with Netflix?
So the long story is that I've been working on writing about Madam Walker and doing research literally for 50 years, since I was a senior in high school in 1970. And in the early 1980s, Alex Haley, who was still writing the wave of Roots, approached us about doing a mini series and a book. I did research for that. We met and talked often about what that would be, but he died before that was finished. Then after I had written On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, which came out in 2001, and which wonderfully had Lisa Drew as my editor, who had been Alex's editor. That book was actually optioned while it was in progress. It was optioned again. Both of those options fell through. And then we had this drought when Hollywood's conventional wisdom was nothing with Black people sells overseas, and so we're not interested. And then April Reign's Oscar So White and the success of Shonda Rhimes and other movies really changed the equation. So in 2015, I was approached again by several different studios and ended up with Mark and Christine Holder of Wonder Street. They optioned the book.
Okay, good. It's interesting that we talk about that you know, the wisdom is that movies about African Americans, or actually people of color, won't sell.
Period, right.
Yeah, period, won't sell. And I often find that so interesting, right? Because when we look at the world population, there, you know, just in terms of the numbers, there are a lot of people of color, you know, more so than there are Caucasians. So you would think that there would be some knowledge that just the numbers alone would mean that movies made by, and it also too, to me, it insults people who are not of color, right? Because it makes it seem like, okay, well, if you're white, you can't be interested in anything that's non-white, and that to me is also disparaging to themselves, for Hollywood to think that white people couldn't be interested in any other people or any other heroes or any other groups of people that are non-white. Like, I would think that would.
And we know that the audience for SelfMade was international.
Yeah.
While Netflix won't confirm this, one of the showrunners posted that it was a 30 million viewership worldwide. Now that's not huge, but it's very respectable.
It's very
respectable. I know from my DMs on Instagram that were in Portuguese that there was a big audience in Brazil.
Yes.
And I know that there were people all over Europe who were very interested. So there was a, and then just from my white friends
Yeah.
in America, I know there was a real interest in the show.
Yeah, I think when people make those kind of assumptions, they're doing a disservice to everybody, right? I think they're doing a disservice to everybody, and thinking of us all as myopic, right? That if I'm Black, I can't appreciate Crazy Rich Asians. It was a fun movie. I loved it. You know what I mean? So I think I hate when people categorize, because it just makes us all seem smaller than we are. Right. And less intelligent. So
well, and that even happens with even with Black writers and showrunners and people in studios, that they assume that a Black audience wants a certain kind of Black character. And sometimes I think they're wrong about what the demographic really wants.
I agree. And then, even when you talk about the Black audience, right? I mean, the Black audience is also not unilateral, right? We also are different classes and different backgrounds, and so one story again is minimizing who I am.
Exactly.
And who our people are, right? We're just not one story. That assumption of that stereotype, we're all over the place. Exactly. Just like any other people.
Just like any other people.
Yeah, for sure. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about SelfMade. I was looking at a couple of things. I've looked at a lot of the trailers and a lot of the videos that are out on YouTube about, the importance of telling this story. And I know that there were some things about it that you felt were not true to the real, not to the book, which I know you said you spent like 50 years, right? A lot of time investigating your great-great-grandmother. And the story came out differently on Netflix. And I wanted to read something that you said and get some feedback from you. And basically this is what it said. It says, when I finally received the script for episode 1 in the spring of 2019, I was beyond shocked. What I had hoped would impress me instead made me cringe. It broke my heart. I had been anticipating hidden figures. Instead, the Real Housewives of Atlanta was staring back at me from the page. Talk to me about that.
So yeah, I just really had a very different vision of what this would be. And it's really based on literally a lifetime of doing research and hearing from people who see Madam Walker as a heroine or somebody who they admire, or just a very interesting historical figure. I knew there were little girls who had done their reports on Madam Walker who wanted to watch this movie with their mothers. I knew there were entrepreneurs who were inspired by Madam Walker. I knew the core audience who was interested in Madam Walker, because I'm all over social media and I could see what was the anticipation that was coming. So I really had, in my mind, the idea of a story that showed you what was going on with African Americans during that period between the Civil War and World War I. Not a boring didactic piece, not a documentary, a real dramatic movie and series. And I think Madam Walker's life, just the facts of her life are really, really quite dramatic. But Nicole Jefferson Asher, the head writer, had pitched to the studios what she thought was a non-traditional biopic. And in that, she wanted to focus on, she wanted to develop a competition and a rivalry between Madam Walker and her real life competitor, Annie Malone. And when we had a conversation in 2015, and which I thought was kind of a casual conversation, and we were just batting ideas around, and she mentioned this was the spine of her story. And I said, well, I would include Annie Malone, but I wouldn't make that the centerpiece. And after that, I had no more conversations with her for 2 years. She actively excluded me from the conversations, from the pitch meetings, because that was her notion of what the story would be. And apparently when I didn't agree with it, she decided that I should not be participating.
So, and part of the reason, as I mentioned earlier, that I do this podcast is to provide value to the people who are listening, right? And so for me, hearing that story for me, it's about lessons learned. And so what I'm hearing from that story is that this is a huge venture. Oh my goodness, Netflix, right? And I know that week it appeared as like one of the #1 shows on Netflix, right? So this huge audience, what did you say, 30 million, right, worldwide? That's a nice number of people.
Exactly.
And you, as a person who was responsible for writing the book and doing the research after all these years, your contribution or your ability to make a difference in that script was minimized. And I just want to talk about that for other people who may be in your position, right? That may have written a book, whether it be a novel or something based on something, from their family. Because I think that what's great about, our history as African Americans, we do have a lot of history. We have a lot of amazing things that have happened in everybody's family that could
Right.
make really big, great drama. But we need to know that, optioning a book may not mean that you have a say in everything that's done as far as the production is concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. This is absolutely lessons learned. And I believe me, when I go into the next project, I will have a very different stance about it. It is amazing that apparently that anything with Black characters gets made it's huge. So we have to, say, yes, that's great. With head writer, showrunners, directors, director of photography, production manager, all Black women. So that is huge. And people really wanted to work on this story. And so I'm grateful for the hard work that people put into it. But the lesson learned for me is this. When we were negotiating my contract, my agent tried very hard to get an executive producer slot, title for me. And all of my friends who work in Hollywood say, if you don't have the executive producer title, then, you can't say anything. And I know that that's true, but I actually think in this situation, even if I had had an executive producer title, if people wanted to exclude me from the conversation, they could do that, because I live in DC. And if somebody's in LA and they have a writer's room, and in fact, they said they had a secret writer's room and they called themselves Las Brujas Negras, the Black Witches. So they really were a very close ecosystem. So even if I had an executive producer slot, I don't know that I would have had a whole lot more sway, because so much of this is about relationships. And if you are receptive and open, yes, you have something on paper, and I know that's how Hollywood operates, but there's a lot that goes on informally and with goodwill.
Yes.
And I think goodwill is really important. So that said, my lesson learned is that when we negotiate the next contract, which I hope there will be, I'm not bitter about Hollywood. I just want to do something different the next time. And I'm almost finished with a major biography on ALelia Walker, Madam Walker's daughter, who I don't think was really written very well into SelfMade. She was very different from that character. I really want to do a series with her because I think her life is epic too. So as we go forward, I would make sure that in the contract, that I have the ability to meet with the people who are being considered as writers. I mean, I just won't do anything else unless I'm going to be part of that process. While I informally was led to believe I would have been in the pitch meetings, there was some funny stuff going on that I was not included in those meetings. I would make sure I am included in those meetings. I would want to make sure that I have conversations with people about who the actors are. Now, ultimately it's the studio that vetoes things and makes the final decisions. But I think that I have enough credibility and enough knowledge of the topic that I'm an asset. And I think this was a kind of a fluke situation. I don't think this will happen going forward. But I think for other people, it's really important to try to stand your ground. You know, Michaela Cole's recent experience that we've all been reading about, where she wanted ownership and how she's been fashioned. It is a lesson for all of us.
Yes. Yes. And I thank you for saying that, because that's what this podcast is about, to celebrate who we are and our accomplishments and the things that have happened, and to celebrate, you know, self-made, but at the same time to see how we can grow. And you touched on a couple of things. One of the things is, you also said this in that same article about, you know, the balancing act, right? And, you know, I think of that as we talk about, you know, what's going on now with Black Lives Matter, and how Black Lives Matter holistically, not just about police brutality, but in terms of everything, including our arts and our, you know, and how little we're portrayed, you know, positively in the media. And so even when you talk about the fact that it's like, we're just so happy that that this kind of film is finally made. I mean, come on, right? Madame J.Walker, that, I mean, I grew up hearing about, right? And it took till 2020, you know, for it to get on the big screen in this kind of, you know, major way with a major studio. But at the same time, there's the balancing act that we also want to make sure that the portrayal is, we just don't want anything on there, right? So it's how do we do that? How do we keep that balancing act, that act? How do we keep it balanced, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
You know, I think that it's really important to have historians or scholars or journalists who have real expertise on the subject matter in the room. And if they're not in that writer's room, you know, 24/7 on speed dial, and a kind of receptivity and embrace of people who really know the material. And I think there's been this dynamic that has existed in Hollywood where the author of the book is like, you know, as they say, throw the book over the fence and take the money. And I don't think that that really works when you're doing historical figures and people of color whose stories have never been told.
Yeah.
You know, where a writer's room is a temporary ecosystem. It is assembled. So, you know, sometimes you get this writer from here and that writer from there, and you're lucky if you get exactly the people you want. And they are there for a finite period of time working on a project, and then they go off to the next project. Meanwhile, the historians and the journalists and the biographers and the people who are doing the research and creating the content have a long-term stake in the narrative. And so I think it's really important. And I think there are many filmmakers who really, you know, acknowledge the role that the storytellers take. And I don't think any historian, there's something called History Studio. It's a group of historians who now work very closely with Hollywood studios. You're probably familiar with them. Erica Dunbar, who wrote Never Caught and who teaches at Rutgers, is one of the co-founders. They're not interested in making boring Hollywood films. They want their work to live and be compelling and interesting. So I think there's some misconception about, you know, what historians really want. What should happen is that they're in the room at the beginning when the story is being conceived, so they can point out other things, as opposed to on the back end when they're in the position of sniping.
Yeah. And also too, I think, you know, as you said, you're left with, you know, understanding, and I think for somebody like yourself who's been in the business for such a long time, you understand that it's not about taking away the creativity, right? Or taking away the drama, because it has to be entertaining. Ultimately, that's what, you know, movies are for. Dramatic narrative movies, they have to be entertaining in some way. So I think that's what people will tend to think. Well, you know, we're not trying to do a documentary here. We're working on a narrative, a dramatic piece, and this is our creative license, so to speak. So, you know, maybe the assumption is that you would get in the way of that, or the biographer would get in the way of that.
Yeah, and I think, yes, that is the assumption, but I'll give you an example of something. I wasn't involved in creating the outline, and it was already approved by the studios. But there, at one point, I was asked by a third party, you know, what do you think about exploring Lelia Walker's sexuality.
Yes.
So I said, well, I wasn't speaking directly to the writers or the showrunners. And I said, well, I'm interested in what you have to say about that. She was part of the Harlem Renaissance. Many of her friends were queer. She was married 3 times. Maybe, I don't have any documentation, I don't have any letters. She might have had a relationship with a woman at the end of her life, but tell me what you would like to do. And nobody discussed this with me. There was well, we think we'd like to have her in a menage a trois. And I said, well, I don't think that's how she rolled. I just, just knowing what I know, I don't think that really fits. So then that apparently got taken off the table. Then the next script that I got had Bricktop, a very famous jazz singer who had lived in Paris and was part of the Harlem Renaissance, as her girlfriend. And I said, because I know the facts, I said, that's interesting because that wouldn't have happened. I met Bricktop in the 1980s when she was performing in New York. And when I was introduced to her as ALelia Walker's great-granddaughter, she said to me, we were not friends. We didn't really like each other. So I said, I'm just trying to tell you that would not have happened. And so ultimately they created a character called Esther who was not real. And they used it as a device to create conflict between Madam Walker and ALelia Walker as a way to, as a plot device. And I said, but the real story, and this is because I know the real story, the real conflict between mother and daughter was over 2 men, both doctors, both handsome. One was kind of a bad boy. One was really a good boy, good guy. Madam Walker, of course, wanted the good guy for her daughter and was suspicious of the bad boy.
Yeah.
Lelia was in love with the bad boy. Ultimately, she ended up marrying both of them. For me, that's a much more dramatic and interesting story.
Yeah.
So I just think that sometimes it's, yes, creativity. You don't want to stand in the way of creativity, but sometimes sort of basing something on the core facts is more interesting than what people make up.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because I think that what you said is true, that you are now left and the people who watched it are now left knowing that it was based on a real person's life. They're left with thinking that the main crust of what happened was true. Because most people, if we're watching it and we say it's based on so-and-so, we think that the majority of this is true. And of course, there was some dramatic stuff put in there, but the majority of this stuff is true. So we're going to definitely assume that her daughter was gay, that she wasn't married at all, because that was the way the story, ended. And yeah, I think that story about, her mother being, the bad boy versus the good, I think as women, a lot of us, that's so basic. That's so great because a lot of times that's what we run into. We run into these great looking, handsome, debonair men, but they're really not good for you, right?
Really not good for you.
Yeah, but that's that definitely would have been a great storyline.
Right.
I also wanted to touch on 1 or 2 other things, and I'm going to let you go. I could be with you all day. I really could.
I'm totally enjoying the conversation. So let's keep going.
Well, one of the other things that you talked about is that I wanted to touch on is this woman versus woman storyline that happened. And for me, especially as a woman, that's about empowering women's visions and voices. And it's funny because I have a son. I have a 20-year-old son. And so, for me, I'm always, I think it's just as important for, men to understand this and to be part of this as well. And so my film festival, I always think of it as being inclusive. So we're not into male bashing or anything like that. So, but I'm also saying this to say that I'm really I'd like to focus on women supporting women, right? Because there's just so many stories that just seem to focus on that we can't get along together, we can't work together, that there's all the cat fights that are happening, a la Real Housewives, whatever city, right? And I mean, and I don't want to put any series down, but let's face it, again, it's the whole thing about based on drama. So drama sometimes is created in those situations, falsely created to create a dramatic effect for those stories. But I'm saying that to say that, you know, it became that her main focus, her main problem, her main issue with her growth as a woman, businesswoman, was this issue with another woman of African descent too, another Black woman. So, and which wasn't true. And
yeah.
so tell us really what the relationship was with the woman, that, you know, was played by, you know, Miss Ijoko.
Right. So, you know, there was, some people may remember there was a recent Broadway musical called War Paint that was about Helena Rubinstein and Elizabeth Arden, who were both, you know, beauty industry people. And that was very much about their competition. Yes. So it's almost as if this was just kind of a spin-off from that, when in fact that wasn't the centerpiece either of Madam Walker's life or Annie Malone's life. But I think that was a kind of default way to create conflict and drama. But in reality, Madam Walker started out in St. Louis. Her brothers were barbers, so she learned something about the beauty or hair care industry from them. Her hair began to fall out. She experimented with products. She was a sales agent for the real life Annie Malone for about 1.5 years. She moved to Denver, where she started selling Malone's products, and then they seem to have had a falling out. I'm not sure exactly what it was over, but at the same time, Madam Walker was working as a cook for a pharmacist who knew how to mix up products, who knew how to mix up formulas. C.J. Walker joined her in Denver. They got married, and she began to market her own line of hair care products. So these two women were definitely competitors, but they both were very successful, and they both had thousands of women who worked for them. They both were philanthropists. And while they were in competition, they were not thinking about each other 24/7. They were developing their own businesses. And so for me and then to have added colorism as part of the key part of the rivalry, which was not the case, just felt like it was tacked on. And I think the audience could see through that.
Yes, yeah, I think we did. In fact, I'm going to tell you that my husband immediately went to Google. He immediately went to Google, and he's like, Yvonne, this is not true. And I said, I know, but the movie's not, you know, it's a dramatic piece. It's not a documentary. He says, yeah, Yvonne, but this was just so unnecessary. And, you know, and he enjoyed the picture, but he's someone that's always believed in, you know, he's a historian. And so he understands, of course, creative license, and he understands, you know, looking for drama and it's just entertaining, but he didn't like that was brought into the equation. One, it really, not only was it not true, but it really probably wasn't necessary.
Yeah, and I still think you could, I mean, colorism obviously is a topic that we need to be thinking about, but I think it could have been brought in another way and not made the crux of the competition, because it makes both women seem petty.
Yes.
And when their real enemy was, you know, the economic system and the racism and the white supremacy that was keeping them from having jobs other than washerwomen and cooks. So I just think there was another way to have done that. I would have made the male characters stronger as well. Mm-hmm. And I thought the men were diminished. F.B. Ransom, Madam Walker's attorney, was really the glue who allowed her to be on the road and be the visionary, because he made sure that essentially the trains ran on time in the factory. And I think he was portrayed as kind of a weak character, the sweetness character who was a pimp and a numbers runner. You know, I know people love Bill Bellamy, but that was a made up character. And Mr. Ransom had taken an oath at 12 years old to never drink, gamble, or smoke, you know. So to have it seem as if he was betting on the numbers and that he had illegal money it was unnecessary. And another historian who writes about Madam Walker said Madam Walker was, you know, sweetness would never have gotten anywhere near her. F.B. Ransom was trying to make sure that she wasn't compromised by some of her more radical political friends like Marcus Garvey and A. Philip Randolph. So that's what he would have been worried about. She wasn't worried about it, but he was worried about it.
Yeah. And what does that do to the ancestors, right? The children and great grandchildren, you know, that are still alive to that person's character, you know?
Yeah, I mean, and I know the descendants of a lot of the people, you know, Du Bois's great grandson, some of Booker T. Washington's descendants, F.B. Ransom's grandchildren are good friends of mine. One of my best friends growing up, who lived 2 doors down from me, is one of F.B. Ransom's granddaughters. So this was what people say, you know, it's about your family and you must feel it in a personal way. It's no, but I feel it for all of the other people, and I feel it for the audience and for the people who are watching, because they have a story now. But the greatness of the people in this generation is diminished by not really letting them shine. And it is kind of, I'm writing something right now, you know, Birth of a Nation, as we know, came out in 1915. That is you know, the wicked and masterful story that is Hollywood's origin story.
Yes.
But while D.W. Griffith, the son of a Confederate general, was doing what he was doing to diminish Black people and to create stereotypes, Madam Walker and F.B. Ransom and W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington were creating a narrative to uplift Black people.
Mm-hmm.
And I really wish that we had been able to, I mean, we saw that some. It was great to see Black people who were prosperous and who were starting businesses, and that part was well done. But I really think that's more the core of their story.
And something else you mentioned is about, as we talk about that too, was about her philanthropy, right? And as part of her legacy. And I don't think, I mean, I think there were a few lines in there that referred to that, but I don't think that that was something that was actually, you know, portrayed as strongly as it possibly could have.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, it is true that when this was first planned, it was first 10 episodes, then it became 8, and then it became 4. So they had the writers and the showrunners really did have to cram a lot in, but they spent so much time, I think, on the Addie, Annie Malone, you know, character that they sort of used up a lot of valuable real estate. But Tyrone McKinley Freeman, who has written a book that will be out in a few months, specifically on Madam Walker's philanthropy, has pointed out that the philanthropy really was just a few lines at the end in the credits. It really didn't explore who she was. And it also didn't really capture what Madam Walker was about. In the film, it's like, I want to be, you know, bigger than Rockefeller, Ford, and Carnegie put together. But Madam Walker's intention was really different from those capitalists and those robber barons. Hers was, I want to make money to help my people. And although it's not that I want to become a millionaire just because I can have the money, it's that I want to know what I can do with that money, what my intention is. And so that I think was, you know, sort of there. If you really looked, you know, really hard, it was kind of between the lines, but I would have lifted it up more.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, you know, I love what you said though about these biographic pictures that are made, because I don't think I thought about that. I don't think I've thought about, you know, for the people who, as you said, have to live with the stories that are there, because it'll be on Netflix. It's an amazing movie. I mean, it's an amazing series, not movie. It's an amazing series, and I enjoyed it. I don't want to get it wrong, but you know, when it's presented in this way, you don't really know what's true and what's not true. And I think for the descendants of the people that were involved and of the true life people, it does leave, perhaps it could leave a bitter taste in the mouth.
Yeah. No, some of Booker T. Washington's descendants, the week after it came out, there was a big discussion among Washington family descendants about just how outraged they were.
Really?
About his portrayal, right? Because the real story about Madam Walker, Booker T. Washington, I think is more interesting than, what was portrayed. They got off to a rocky start. It's true. Madam Walker appeared at one of his conventions and he didn't give her the chance to speak. She seized that chance and made an amazing speech. But then the next year, after having not included her, the next year he invited her back as a keynote speaker. And then when he came to Indianapolis for the dedication of the Black YMCA, to which she had contributed $1,000, she had her chauffeur pick him up at the train station and he was a guest in her home. So there was an arc to that story. It wasn't, you need to be back in the kitchen and that's where we leave it. It was, we develop a relationship with each other.
Yeah. And so then we're left with the impression Mr. Washington as being the sexist, man that couldn't get over himself and couldn't get over the fact that a woman was trying to, make it in a quote unquote man's world.
Right.
Yeah. And
he was the man of hhis time, but yes. His wife, Margaret Murray Washington, who's not really portrayed quite accurately, but still she's in there. She was, a very strong woman who was the president of the National Association of Colored Women, the dean of girls at Tuskegee, well-traveled, So I think these things, some of these stories from this period of time are so unimaginable for us because we don't know our history. And we, we're used to, Black people were enslaved and then there was the Civil Rights Movement. And all those things that happened in between, those are the stories that I think we need to hear and not just do the cliches. I think that a young audience would be interested in knowing that these people were badasses, but in the way that they were, not in the way that we want to superimpose upon them.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we do know so little about our history because, that's a whole other conversation as to why we're certainly not taught. And so we're, in our traditional school system. So it's something that we have to do ourselves for our own children and for ourselves.
And Hollywood can play a really important role. Doesn't have to be boring. It can be the core of the person, but Hollywood is really powerful. And that's where a lot of people get their history. So we need to help them have accurate information.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned was that, the people who are involved in this project, the writers, the executive producers, they themselves were of African descent. So what do you think their focus was? Was it about getting something that was palatable to Hollywood, or do you think that they just felt that this is a better story?
Well, I think they have to answer that, but I do know that in our conversations, they kept reminding me it wasn't a documentary. And of course, I worked in television news for 30 years, so I know the difference. But I think it was a big project. I think they wanted to get it made. They wanted it to be commercial. I don't know what their conversations were with the executives at Netflix and Warner and what kind of compromises they might have had to have made. But they were trying to tell a story that they, as the head writer said, would be appealing to a younger audience. And I think some of those decisions, kind of underestimated what an audience would have wanted. And I will say again that, a writer's room is people who aren't experts in the field. They are doing a project. They want to get the next project. They want this project to sell as well as it can. And they don't really know history. Most of us grew up not really liking history class because it was boring. But history itself is not boring. But some people who aren't part of the Hollywood writing community know much more about the facts.
Well, I think that leads us back to what you said earlier. And I think maybe the main lesson of this particular edition of Real Moments, and for everybody that's listening, whether it be Hollywood or any other but especially Hollywood, because we know of the way it is, right? But just in terms of making sure that which is important to you, that you make sure that that part of it, what's important to you, that you get that legal right to be able to have a say.
Right.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And as I say, I think this was kind of an unusual situation that sort of fell the way that it did. But I'm now feeling very comfortable about being outspoken, and really trying to help others, and really advocating for having historians and biographers as part of the process early on. I
Yeah.
think it makes a huge difference, and I think there's real potential for collaboration and a sweet spot where everybody is lifting everybody else up.
Yes, I agree. I agree. So can you tell me what you're up to, how the audience of Real Moments can support you, and how can we help you? Where can we find you?
So I am on Twitter and Instagram at ALelia Bundles, ALelia Bundles. My websites are aleliabundles.com and madamcjwalker.com. And I am almost finished with The Joy Goddess of Harlem, ALelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, which will be published by Scribner during the summer of 2021. And I hope that I will have an opportunity to see that as a series eventually. And there are other projects, other Madam Walker projects that I will continue to work on. So I would love for people to come to the website, sign up for the newsletter, follow me on Instagram and Twitter, and that way they will know what's coming next.
Well, I look forward to that. I've always been fascinated by that whole, the Harlem Renaissance, and that whole beautiful period of, Black art, right? In every form. So I think that would be a very beautiful and wonderful story to read. And hopefully see, as you said, in a series.
Right. Well, and I think, ALelia Walker's life is so interesting. She's kind of been made into this little caricature, like her mother made the money, she spent the money. But yeah, she traveled internationally. She was a great patron of the arts. She knew everybody, and everybody wanted to be at her parties during the 20s. So her story is actually made for Hollywood.
Yeah. And I don't think you mentioned, or maybe you did, that you also have, a hair company, a hair product company. So talk to us about that. I just want to.
Right. So the MCJW is the line of hair care products inspired by Madam C.J. Walker, manufactured by Sundial Brands, and available on Sephora. So yes, I'm so happy that in addition to the books that I write, I am the historical consultant for MCJW and a consultant on various projects, museum exhibits. The Madam Walker's home in Irvington, Villa Lawaro, is a National Historic Landmark, as is the Madam Walker Legacy Center in Indianapolis. So I'm able to lift Madam Walker up on a number of platforms.
And you're busy.
I'm busy.
That sounds like you're busy. That definitely sounds badass, right? And so I want to thank you for taking your time to be with us today and to tell us your story. And I encourage people to watch, despite what we said. I don't think that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't want people to, not watch. I just want them to watch and, enjoy Octavia Spencer, enjoy Blair Underwood, Carol, who plays F.B. Ransom, enjoy the hair, the wigs are great, and understand that this is a story that is a fictionalized version, and then read the book, read On Her Own Ground, and push for more stories about people of color, and especially about women. You can count the biopics. There's What's Love Got to Do with It? There's Introducing Dorothy Dandridge. There's Hidden Figures with Katherine Johnson. I mean, there are very few stories about Black women. There are some in the pipeline. Lena Horne's granddaughter is working on something for Showtime. There are things that are getting ready to come. but we need to be advocates for these stories, and we need to hold the studios accountable.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the fact that you can, you know, you can mention them, you know, on one hand is very telling, right? The fact that we can start to list them is at all, you
Right.
know, is very telling about the need for more. So definitely, definitely. So really the message there is that once they do come, we need to support as much as possible.
That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for saying that.
Thank
And
you.
thank you so much for being with us for another edition of Real Moments with Badass Women in Film and Entertainment. And this woman is so badass. Thank you once again. And we will continue to stay in touch because I know I'm always following everything that you do on Instagram and Facebook. And we will continue. And maybe when the series comes out, we'll be able to do an episode at the Women's International Film Festival. I would love that.
Would love that. Would love
Okay.
that. So glad
Okay.
to reconnect.
Yes, me too. Take care. Thanks again.